Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center's Middle East Program's webinar, Policing the Religious Message in MENA. Has it worked and what are the outcomes? We're delighted to have MEP fellow Genève Abdo lead today's discussion with an expert panel to better understand religious freedoms in MENA societies, religious intolerance, and the challenge for the region in balancing democratic principles with religious beliefs. I'd like to welcome our panelists, Peter Mandeville, a senior advisor at USIP's Religious and Inclusive Societies team, Dalia Fahmy, associate professor of political science at Long Island University and author of a forthcoming book on the rise and fall of the Muslim Brotherhood and the future of political Islam, and Hassan Hassan, founder and editor-in-chief of New Lines Magazine, an initiative of the New Lines Institute. I'd like to also remind all of you to submit your questions in the comments box or via Twitter to MEP's handle at Wilson Center MEP. And without further ado, Genève, over to you. And I look forward to an enriching discussion. It's a very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and good morning to everyone. And a special thanks to the panelists who have spent many years studying this topic, conducting research in the field, publishing. So thanks to you, Marissa, for hosting this, because it's sort of a subject that has in recent years been somewhat understudied, or there is less attention to the subject in the think tank community than there had been 10 years ago. So I'll just offer some brief remarks for an overview to get us started. Across the Arab world, regimes are increasingly intervening in Islamic institutions, including religious ministries, universities, and mosques. And this has been particularly true since the 2011 uprisings. Particularly the regime's very sophisticated techniques, which they developed since the uprising to quash all opposition, particularly the opposition that was of religious nature. The pandemic further accelerated this and allowed the governments to co-opt religious institutions, for example, to dictate whether citizens should wear masks or whether they should be vaccinated. And this process has converged with the emergence of a younger generation in the Middle East, which, unlike their parents, is far less interested in public expressions of religiosity. And they seem to be opposed to religious influence in politics. And we see this from our own research. We see this from polling data. After the Egyptian government carried out a military coup against the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013, and overturned the democratic election that brought them to power, that created this kind of perception in the Middle East that political Islam was on the decline, if not it had been killed entirely. And this was further sort of emphasized by Gulf states. They declared the Brotherhood a terrorist organization incorrectly, and this led to human rights violations and repression in the Middle East. However, we are seeing, perhaps since 2018, that there are some indicators that perhaps the secularization of Middle East society is becoming more complicated. Has it become secularized, or is the picture more complicated? And we see this in countries such as Iraq, where polling indicates that although Iraqis are against any form of Islamic government, they still believe that clerics should have some sort of advisory role in state matters. And more recently, just 2 weeks ago, in fact, there was polling data published by the Arab Barometer, which of course is the very respected polling agency, which indicates that in the MENA region, we have seen an increase in levels of religiosity, particularly among youth. And this is something that is pretty surprising over the last 5 years. The results of this polling indicate that political Islam could be experiencing a comeback. In most countries surveyed, citizens, both young and old, demonstrated a clear preference for giving religion a greater role in politics. And this is the first time we've seen this since the Arab uprisings. So today's discussion is very timely, and the questions that we will try to answer are we seeing the secularization of the region and a retreat from Islamism? Or, as the polling indicates, are young Arabs indeed becoming more religious? What implications might this have for the region? And does this rise, perhaps, in personal religiosity correspond with changes in the role of politics, in the role of religion in politics? And how might this change foreshadow a new role for radical groups? So will radical groups try to capitalize on this trend, or will we see the continued decline of radical groups in the region? So I'll first turn to Peter to sort of lay out the landscape for us. And Peter, I'd like to ask you, just to get us started, how has the relationship between governments and religious institutions and society in the Middle East, how has this relationship changed in recent years? How do you see these shifts? And what are the regional drivers of some of these shifts?
Sure. Thanks very much, Genev, and I'm grateful for the invitation to be part of the discussion this morning. So I think it's fair to say that over the last couple of decades, we've seen a very clear trend in terms of a shift in the relationship between states and religious institutions and religious actors in the Middle East and North Africa. You dated it in your account just now, kind of from the time of the Arab uprisings. I think it starts a little bit earlier. And I think the broad central thrust of that trend is one of the state leaning into the religious sector more, sometimes with a kind of regulatory hand, sometimes trying to very overtly co-opt certain religious actors or to orchestrate the issuance of religious messages that are conducive to various aspects of state policy. So while there's that broad identifiable trend, I think the political logic behind it has evolved over time. And there's sort of kind of three main periods of it. There's like a post 9/11 period where it was mainly about trying to show that states in the region are opposed to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the broad Salafi jihadi trend. We see this in, for example, the Amman message in the mid-2000s, activities by the International Union of Muslim Scholars associated with the late Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And then we have a post-Arab uprisings version of it that is really about states trying to protect themselves, insulate themselves against threats posed by Islamist movements and parties once we saw the enormous success that some of those groups enjoyed after the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. In Saudi Arabia, there's a slightly different logic where the kind of clampdown on the religious sector, religious establishment is really about Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman consolidating his authority while also trying to keep Islamist forces in check. And I think we're now experiencing kind of a third wave of this that is really about the advent of a post-Western global order and the fact that some of the states and governments in the region are realizing that religion and engaging regional and cross-regional politics through a religious layer actually enables certain kinds of alliance formations that are taking place that connect the Middle East to countries like Russia and India and China in different kinds of ways. So there's this broad thrust, but the kind of the drivers of it that you asked about, I think, have evolved over time.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I mean, I think that the study of this topic has always focused on sort of regional drivers. So could you elaborate a little bit more, because what you said is a little bit counterintuitive. How has the sort of more global expansion of this relationship, how has it affected the relationship between states and religious institutions? Because I would assume that this would be more of a vehicle or tactic to de-emphasize religious institutions and religiosity in society. But what I understand you're saying is sort of the opposite. So maybe you could elaborate on that point.
Right. So it's about, so I can see how on the face of it that might be mutually exclusive. In fact, I think it's about the idea of trying to promote a certain kind of religiosity that is state approved. And so I think there's this important shift that takes place between the 9/11 manifestation of the post 9/11 manifestation of it and the New World Order, the New Global Order manifestation of it. So in the 9/11 phase, I think it was mainly about regional states in MENA trying to assure their Western security partners that they were in line with, ideas of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. I think today it's as much about sending messages to the likes of China and Russia and India that there's a shared view of politicized religion as something that's problematic, particularly politicized Muslims that need to be regulated by the state. Obviously, that's a trend in India now. We've seen it in China. We see it in Russia as well. And when I say that religion provides a cultural layer to changing alliance structures, what I mean is that there's a lot of Russian outreach by the Kremlin that is coordinated with the Russian Orthodox Church that's framed more in terms of traditional and family values, and it allows Russia to reach out to audiences in the conservative Muslim world and say, hey, the West is trying to promote certain kinds of values that you're against, LGBTQ rights, feminism, abortion. Russia is the global champion of traditional and family values, and so you should see that going forward, your values and your interests are more aligned with us. That's kind of the shift that I'm trying to get at.
That's very interesting. And of course, as we know, this shift has created human rights violations, which I hope we can get to later, and sort of restrictions on religious expression. So Dahlia, I would like to turn to you if you could focus specifically. You've done a lot of research on Egypt and in the context of the Muslim Brotherhood. If you could sort of update us on your recent research. You're writing a book on the Muslim Brotherhood. Is political Islam now basically, has the state triumphed over political Islam in Egypt? And how, if you can also give us your analysis of what has happened in Tunisia, which of course is somewhat of a parallel example of what happened in Egypt in 2013.
Thank you, Genevieve, and to everyone and my co-panelists and to the Wilson Center. So absolutely, this is an important conversation, but I'd like to unpack a few terms that could possibly focus our conversation a little bit more. When we talk about Islam and Islamization, or political Islam, or the future of political Islam, there's a difference between Islam as a lived experience, a personal experience, an interpersonal experience, Islam as articulated by social movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood, and then when they moved into politics and governance, and Islamists in governance, and then what happens when Islamists in governance fail or are removed from office. And so there's an underlying current that is the use of religious language, but are we really still talking about Islam when we are looking at where it is in society and in politics? And so I think what we're alluding to is this notion of secularization in places like Egypt is different than, the secular state in France, of course, or here in the United States, where here in the United States religion is everywhere, but not in governance. In Egypt today, secularization looks like state control of the religious narrative, or a state version of Islam, or a state reference point of what is acceptable in terms of referencing religion. And this comes from the crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood following the 2013 military coup. And so what we find happening today in Egypt, or let's talk a little bit about the Brotherhood in particular, is that their positioning within society, but also their positioning within the greater narrative of Islamization has shifted greatly. If we look at the crisis that has been evolving within the Brotherhood since 2013, it's not just that much of the leadership has been arrested or in exile or even passed away in prison, but that there is a deeper crisis within the Brotherhood that started emerging in 2021, when you saw a conflict between the late leader or acting leader of the Brotherhood in London versus the leadership inside of Istanbul. And so you had the de facto leader in London at odds with the control of, for example, Brotherhood finances and media. And what distinguished the 2021 crisis within the Brotherhood is the involvement of high leaders who are typically responsible for managing the kind of public-facing narrative of the Brotherhood. And it occurred in the backdrop of massive repression. And so what you start to see is those that were seen as the religious political leadership having very political issues within them. And so to understand the root causes of the crisis of the Brotherhood during the backdrop of increased repression and marginalization by the state is that the historic rigidity of the Brotherhood, which historically hampered their ability to adapt to current situations, also leading to leadership or decision-making in the hands of very few, created a feeling among younger brothers of, this is not the Brotherhood that we signed on to. And so a major internal rift, ideological rift, and political rift has led to the questioning that we used to have in 2013 of, is the Brotherhood a social movement, an ideology, or a political party? Where today is it over? Is its time period over? Are we talking about something else? And when we think about political opposition in the Middle East, especially in a place like Egypt, historically it was centered around the state versus the Brotherhood, or the state versus Islamism or political Islam. And it was almost by design, because the Egyptian state, for example, through its party laws, prevented the rise of secular parties, leftist parties, socialist parties. And so when we saw the revolution happen in 2011, we saw the immediate birth of a lot of new parties that were articulating a secular, liberal, leftist platform. But they did not have anywhere near the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you started to see historically the contestation over state power used the religious narrative. Today, at 2011, it became more pluralistic in nature. However, this short-lived experiment where you then had the Brotherhood come into power under President Morsi, controlling much of the parliament, and then the military coup thereafter, what started happening is that society was coupling religion with political Islam. And when Islamists failed or removed from office, the perception was, has the future of religion in the political structure also been reflected in the social structure? And so today what you find is that the current president is renewing that movement of co-opting religious institutions such as Dar al-Ifta and Al-Azhar, where they are providing legitimacy for the authority, where this newfound state narrative of religion, or what religion is as per the state, is permeating into society. And so when we see indicators that there might be a religiosity happening, it's actually a secularization. It's the increase of a state narrative of religion. And this takes place differently in different parts of the MENA region. And so to, I think, understand, we have to unpack the political, social, economic, and religious forces operating within each state. Now, coming to the current situation in Tunisia, where the leader of the Nahda party, Al-Ghannouchi, was arrested last month, we see that Qais Said, the current president, is actually co-opting this in a different way, where he's taking what was seen as, or who is seen as, the most moderate and liberal voice among the Islamists and putting him into prison. And again, this creates a bifurcation into the future. Will it be more religious in terms of political opposition to the state, or is religion going to be deemed in terms of the state control of the narrative? Now, remember, Ghannouchi progressively made the Nahda much more democratic, less focused on an Islamic orientation, and much more in terms of the narrative of Muslim Democrats, Muslims in political political office, kind of stripping it of the history of looking for Islamization of the state. And this becomes a lot more threatening to the state because it's not in terms of the scary language of religion, rather than religion as a set of moral principles. And so the arrest of al-Nahda and those who were, the arrest of Ghannouchi and those who are articulating a more moderate approach to Islam in the public sphere and in politics becomes a part of the state strategy, because as we're seeing throughout much of the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia with the arrest of liberal or moderate scholars, is that the center becomes much more threatening to the state. Either you want those that are extremely on the right because it's easy to crack down on them, or those that have accepted the state narrative of control on religion as a way to create a quietist society that no longer uses religion to object to the role of the state.
That's very fascinating. And thank you so much for explaining all the complexities involved in what people are calling the secularization of the region. I wanted to ask you specifically about Egypt because, I guess the one of the important questions is, why has el-Sisi succeeded where Mubarak failed? So you did mention that, as we know, Mubarak, former President Mubarak, created an accommodation with the Brotherhood over many years, and which allowed them even to enter politics to begin with in an official way. And you have mentioned that it's sort of when the Brotherhood was in power in Egypt, the narrative was that they were more extremist. So whereas the threat in the past was a more extreme interpretation of Islam, now the threat is a more moderate practice of Islam as at least as a political force. But can you tell us, is it the demographics that have changed, Egyptian society in general that's changed, which has allowed this new state-dominated narrative to succeed now under el-Sisi, whereas it probably would have failed under Mubarak?
Well, I think the current situation is looking at the intersection of several factors. You have extreme state repression. The Human Rights Watch, all of the human rights organizations are putting a picture of what's happening in Egypt as worse than it ever has been. And so any political activity, anything outside of the narrative of the state, is considered under the terrorism law a threat to national security. If anyone has, for example, more than 5,000 Twitter followers and says anything outside of the state narrative, you can be arrested and put into prison under the terrorism laws. You don't get a civil trial, get a military trial. And so the level of repression is freezing society to a certain extent. Add to that Egypt has more internal debt than it ever has, 3 times more it has increased threefold under Sisi, and its external debt, of course, has also increased threefold under President Sisi. Add to that the pandemic, the floating of the Egyptian pound twice. Everyday life has become so difficult that talking about politics becomes what is much secondary to the survival of the day. And add to that the layer of repression. How you break society, and I think Egypt has mastered this since Nasser, is you create a level of fear of the other. You break civil society. And one of the strategies was to create, for example, a hotline of report your neighbor, right? Balagh ala garak. When you are reporting your neighbor, then you're breaking the social fabric. And what used to be communal, talking about the day, has now been relegated to simply prayer, right? It's no longer coming together in the mosques as we used to study historically of this is the space of social and political activity. Today, it's a much more individualized experience. So the secularization of society comes from a security perspective, a security narrative in this regard. If you look at, for example, under Mubarak versus under Sisi, the 2000s are very different than today. We had, President Bush and at that time Secretary Condoleezza Rice, when they were talking about the ridding of the world of the two T's, terror and tyranny. Tyranny, they were actually projecting towards Egypt. And so the push in 2004, 2005 for Egypt to have a little bit more pluralistic elections allowed for the running of members of the Muslim Brotherhood as independents, because it was still banned under President Mubarak. And when they won 88 seats in 2005, 22% of the parliament, you saw a very different political activity emerge from the Brotherhood, where it was much more not in keeping with the stereotype, where they were articulating food security policies, where they were looking for the security of the Egyptian pound, not the Islamization of society. And that level of parliamentary work, I argue in my book, the opening of the political structure to the public to see the operations, but also to witness the levels of corruption they had lived under. And then the December 2010 election that was the most rigged, where none of the independents won a single seat in office. A month later, you have a revolution, is indicative of the place of Islamists in the political sphere of Egypt, rather than the what we talk about today. The 10-month experiment of Islamists in the seat of the presidency also fell on the backdrop of several factors. Members of the Brotherhood who went into power say we were in power, but we were in office, but we were not in power. They didn't have the keys to the government, per se. There are also foreign intervention, the UAE, the media. And so while they did maybe overshoot their assumptions of their own power, there were also many other factors that led to the perception of the Brotherhood being incompetent and much more rigid and radical, although we don't find the concrete evidences of these narratives per se. And so again, it becomes a struggle for the political sphere under the backdrop in the name of security, but also in the backdrop of several vertices that we need to understand: the role of foreign intervention, the role of the economy, both internal and external, and also the role of the Brotherhood in terms of their internal struggle. And what we're seeing today is a much more fractionated, divided Brotherhood, where historically they used to measure their legitimacy in terms of proximity to al-Banna, or how many years in prison you were. Today, it's, were you there in the revolution? And since the revolution, what have you done? And to the average young person today, who was an elementary school student during the revolution, they not only do not know the Brotherhood, they only know them as an absentee force that failed, or an absentee force that was not part of the putting together of the revolution. And so it's a very different public, it's a very different political backdrop. And I think this is why at this juncture, we have to look at this as a different Egypt.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you noted a historical fact which is often overlooked, and that is that there were a lot of factors, there were a lot of forces undermining the Brotherhood when it was in power. So the perception has always been that they were Islamists and couldn't govern, incompetent, they pushed the limits too far. But in fact, this has been documented by the US government, in fact, that there were forces within the military that plotted its ouster from power from day one. So thank you for noting that. So Hassan, I wanted to turn to you to try to help us focus a bit on the Gulf, taking into account many of the excellent points Dalia just made about control over the state narrative. And of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia, as you've written extensively, we have a very complex picture that's different from Egypt. As you've written, that Wahhabism, which was the state ideology, it suffered from its own demise. So that it would have been bankrupt even if Mohammed bin Salman had not taken control of the religious messaging. In his sort of declaration about moderate Islam coming to Saudi Arabia, which he declared in 2017. So can you talk to us about how you see the landscape in the Gulf and the UAE and Saudi in terms, I mean, of course, the UAE is also somewhat of an extreme example of how they have controlled and really crushed any sort of religious expression that doesn't conform to what the state has dictated. So can you tell us a bit about how you see the Gulf, particularly in Saudi Arabia?
Sure. Thank you for hosting this panel. Just at the conceptual level, just to connect it to what Dalia and Peter said before, in the region, obviously, the word Islamism and Islamist is essentially an academic term, and it's a modern term. The word in Arabic is Islami, or Islamic. Essentially, it could be Islamic or Islamist. So essentially, I think both organizations, ideologies, and the state compete over who's Islamic or Islamist in that sense. So both of them claim that they are. Even Islamists, actually, if you ask them, they say, don't call us Islamist. We are Islamic organizations. So just to kind of put that out there, that, I remember even a conversation I had with one of the senior officials in the Gulf about this. I asked a very specific question about, don't you fear that these campaigns that, your country, not going to specify the country, launching against Islamists and media and, even military will be perceived as attacks against Islam and Islamic ideologies? And he explained that, obviously, I think Dalia explained it well, that that kind of mix in between Islamic space and the role of Islamists and how the state is trying to control it. He was saying basically that we are actually religious, and we are celebrating yearly all kind of religious activities, and generally there is religiosity among the leadership in that sense. They observe, they do all this, they follow the religious rituals and so on and so forth. The idea is to decouple that, that religiosity somehow is the domain of Islamists, or even, and that's really the tricky part of it. But to go back to your question, I think I remember we followed the rise of ideologies, in my country, Syria, and in the region, groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. And I think at the time, the framing was, rightly so, focused on how we undermined and underestimated and downplayed the role of ideologies all those years, that there's so much appeal to identity and religion and so on and so forth, and that secularization and Western ways of doing things are not effective in suppressing these ideologies. And now it seems like we are doing the opposite of underestimating the role of states. And I think the states, both there's the kind of resurgence of the role of the state in controlling religion, but also there's resurgence of the religious establishments that had always been the center of religiosity in the region. We're talking about Al-Azhar in Egypt and what it represents, not as an institution, but as a religiosity, an Egyptian religiosity. People talk in the region about a Shami Islam, a Levantine Islam, an Egyptian Islam, an Iraqi Islam. And all the implication here is that there is an indigenous religiosity that respects diversity. For example, it's more tolerant, more pragmatic, and so on and so forth. And that these organizations that came and dominated our ideologies in the past century started to carve out space for themselves. We're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and later Salafi jihadism. They started to carve out space at the expense of the central state. So they would maybe appeal in rural areas, even though I always argue these ideologies are actually urban ideologies that happen to dominate in rural areas. So in rural areas that they're not compatible with the local community, but somehow because of the vacuum, these ideologies have carved out space in these areas. And what happened in 2011 was a wake-up call for these central states. Negative or positive, for better or worse, meaning they started to say, oh, we need to go back and prop up all this religious establishments that existed in much of the region for a while. And for years and years after, first after 9/11, but later after 2011, these religious establishments proved to be very slow to act, very academic-y in the sense that they're very, if they want to issue a fatwa against ISIS, it would have to be 100 pages of very austere citation and things like that. And that didn't really appeal on the local level. And jihadis were more agile. There was war, there was conflict, so they were more, they would resonate more. That's why, for example, King Abdullah, the late King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, he did something nobody did before, which is to bring all the ulama in one place on national television to rebuke them and say, you're lazy. You're unable to push back against these ideologies and speak up against them because they were very slow to act. And I think that is changing now. I think if you go back to Syria, to Egypt, elsewhere in the region, even in the Gulf, maybe Saudi still needs more time. But in the UAE, for example, that's kind of well ahead of other countries in the sense of co-opting local establishments and getting them to organize themselves again and become more agile and responding and appealing and really controlling the religious narrative in these areas. So in that sense, I think states are really reviving these old, for better or worse. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's becoming more organized than before. At the same time, and that's where I think they will succeed because the time is on their side. We see the hollowing out of all these ideologies that existed and kind of resurged, like I said, in the past century, from the Muslim Brotherhood to ISIS, across the spectrum. They are becoming, there's a lot less appeal to them. And like you said in the beginning, that process started really before. And I think 2011, the uprisings gave them a new life. And now they're dying. And I think the framing, and this is the tricky part of it. Whenever something is retreating, people say they're dying or there's decline, and that's short-sighted. Some people say the counter narrative to this is that this has happened before. The Muslim Brotherhood has seen really bad times before, and they were able to overcome that and return. Same thing, ISIS in Iraq was defeated almost to annihilation, and then came back stronger. Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. In my opinion, that's different this time. I think it's really there's more. It's complicated to kind of cite all the reasons, but in my opinion, I think Wahhabism, for example, has been hollowed out way before Mohammed bin Salman the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, came to power. And I think that process started in the late 1990s, probably after 9/11. But also, Wahhabism was already a very small actor in the region. Like, it's exaggerated, it punched way above its weight because of the resources it had, especially in the 1990s and 80s before that. But it is a small organization. In that sense, it was a bubble that burst. And I don't think it's up to the Saudis now to revive it. It's no longer, even if Mohammed bin Salman decides, you know what, Wahhabism actually is a very good thing for us, we want to revive it, I don't think they're going to have that same role they had before. So in that sense, the process started before him, but he did accelerate its demise. And I don't think that will go back. In my opinion, that applies to other organizations. I've been saying for years that Al-Qaeda is exaggerated, and that jihadi watchers in the West, in Washington DC and elsewhere, watch the videos of Zawahiri more than Zawahiri followers watch his videos. As in, these organizations have become so irrelevant that the only people kind of paying attention to them are the people who are analyzing them. So we can talk for so long like what each organization is suffering now, but the general point that I wanted to make is that I think this time is different. I think states are more prepared now, and there is an interesting process of reviving these old religious schools that act on the local level and resonate locally.
Thank you. You made such important points. And I just want to ask as a follow-up, because of course, as you mentioned, the analysts following ISIS and other groups, perhaps they sometimes exaggerate their power or importance. And that's always been an issue in Washington, since most of us are sitting in Washington. Is Al-Qaeda dead? Is it on the decline? So in terms of ISIS, would you say that what you've said about sort of Islamist groups in general, does that apply to ISIS now in Iraq and Syria? Because of course there's always concern, particularly among the Iraqis, that ISIS could reconstitute itself in parts of Iraq.
So that's a good follow-up, because when we say these ideologies die, they really don't die, they transform to something else. They become even sometimes more radical, but not necessarily in the sense of Islamism as we know it. Some of them become a lot more moderate. So when it comes to, before ISIS, when it comes to Islamism, I think Islamism is probably morphing into more kind of Western style debates. Like, you have a lot of those Islamist and Islamic activists on YouTube and elsewhere who are acting more or kind of debating more of the same issues that Jordan Peterson, for example, in the West, or kind of the manosphere tendency we've been writing about, for example, the magazine, Andrew Tate and things like that. So Islamists are becoming, not Islamists in general, but I'm saying there are some trends where the way they express their Islamism now is in the same cultural conservatism that exists, for example, in the United States. So there's misogyny, there is anti-gay rights, all the kind of things that really you see, expressed in the West, and that's kind of a vehicle for a lot of those activists now. In terms of jihadism, militants and stuff like that, I think militancy will continue for a while, but I think the vacuum is a lot less than before. States are more controlled; they know more how to fight these organizations. Initially, I thought ISIS would have a more kind of a longer shelf life compared to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda kind of died, in my opinion. The academics who were saying Al-Qaeda died with bin Laden in 2011 were right. I know a lot of people say they were proved wrong because Al-Qaeda resurged with the Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, in Syria and elsewhere, and after 2011. But I think that was really just the last gasp. Like they really died then. And then they tried to become relevant, but when they became relevant by the same people who really ended Al-Qaeda, meaning the anti-Al-Qaeda, which is ISIS within jihadism. But then ISIS now is dying also, in my opinion, as a viable organization. It will continue, but I'm comparing like from going from one level to kind of just becoming a manageable disease, essentially, they can control with pills and stuff like that, rather than kind of a morbid kind of
execution.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I hope that we can, in some of the questions that are being asked, if we can integrate the discussion of the fallout of all of this in terms of human rights violations. Because the obvious question is, so if the state has become a lot more sophisticated in its tactics, why hasn't there been at least some pushback? And, particularly as all of you have pointed out, the human rights situation has totally deteriorated. So if you can sort of try to integrate this question into what we're gonna, in our attempt to answer some of the questions from the audience. So the first question is, and I'll just address this to all of you, perhaps all of you can offer your response. Can you have a real secularization as long as personal status laws affecting marriage, divorce, custody require a religious affiliation? The lack of non-religious civil options seem to perpetuate religious identity. So I think that that's a good way to sort of talk about the personal freedoms of people. How can you have the secularization of society when you have these laws that are still in effect, that are totally, sort of from a different era, as it regards personal status laws, marriage, divorce, and particularly child custody, the custody of children. So could all of you try to sort of address this question in the framework of human rights issues? I'll go first, sorry, to Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much, Genevieve. The question of personal status laws is really important because I think particularly among folks in the United States and Europe observing developments in the Muslim world, they hear like the term Sharia, and they assume that it's mainly that most of the discussions and activities around Sharia is about, very extreme forms of corporeal punishment, stoning adulterers, the cutting off of limbs, agitation to create Islamic states, when in fact, it's actually much more everyday issues around daily life practices, around questions of marriage, death, inheritance, that's really where the politics of Sharia manifest themselves on a day-to-day basis in the lives of many Muslims. So this continues to be a contested space. Again, I don't think that the sort of binary question of secular versus not secular is the correct framework or terrain in which to have this conversation. Because, arguably, you have a version of the same thing going on in the politics of the United States right now, around many of the legal debates around access to reproductive health, where religious views are quite central to that. So I don't think we're talking about something that is about, resurrecting age-old normative frameworks that are somehow uniquely present only in the Muslim majority world. There is, this is why in my remarks this morning, and I think picked up again and echoed in things that Hassan offered, there is this broader terrain of global culture wars, that in which some of these questions are very central, but they're not. We need to get rid of the idea that this is somehow a set of discussions limited to the Muslim majority world, or that only Islam or Muslims are participating in. There's now this rich transnational sphere in which conservative American evangelical groups, activist networks funded by the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church, the transnational Hindutva movement out of India, and a wide range of conservative Muslim groups are all actually working together on these issues. So, I would want to pull the question out of a uniquely Islamic context and repose it at a sort of global level.
Thank you. Dalia.
If I could add to that, just the politics behind this as well. When the legal code was designed in Egypt, for example, based on the French model, the only area where it was not redesigned was in the realm of personal status laws, and that was relegated to the religious establishment. The same thing happened in 2001 after 9/11, when the United States went into both Iraq and Afghanistan. The constitutions of Iraq and Afghanistan relegated personal status laws to the sphere of the religious establishment. And so when we think about narratives regarding Sharia and women, it's by design. Religious scholars are not discussing things like food security and debt and interest. Again, very much part of Sharia. Rather, they're relegated to these issues of marriage, inheritance, divorce, and child custody. And so you start to see the majority, for examples, of the fatwas around this in Egypt are coming on these issues rather than other issues, because the religious establishment has actually been circled into these topics. And so when we look at, for example, authoritarianism in a place like Egypt, it's actually gendered in nature. By design. And when you think of the narratives that came out during the revolution, when Mubarak was referring to the protesters in the square, it was, are these girls who are sleeping in Tahrir Square really fighting for your dignity? The ones who are sleeping outside? Again, remember, we had virginity tests. We had a crackdown that was on the bodies of women. We saw the case of the blue broad girl, the girl that was dragged, stripped of her clothing, right? The shaming. And so this is part of the political design of religious authority being encircled around the issue of personal status law. So it's built into the legal system that the place of negotiation, the place of negotiation is on the bodies of women and their position in society. And so I think we need to look at the larger political picture rather than just is the penal code, religion, Sharia, and women, right? There's a design by it. And the design has relegated the negotiation of the religious authority at the expense of women. And so when we saw the 2000 personal status laws change in Egypt, it was through a marriage of the feminists and the Islamists saying that the current penal code is against the ethos of Islam. For example, women could not divorce until the year 2000, or in Islam, technically, women could initiate a no-fault divorce. And so it was a marriage of feminists and Islamists coming together and saying the articulation of personal status laws is un-Islamic, has been un-Islamic. And so, again, I think we need to look at the politics behind it, the design, and why the sphere of religious negotiation has been limited to women and women's issues. And then on the international level, why is it that the same senators out of Texas who were fighting for the liberation of the Afghan women are the same ones who are trying to curtail women's reproductive rights here in the United States? And so the gendered nature of social control is an international issue.
Thank you. That's a very excellent point. Hassan, in the Gulf, I guess there's always a lot of focus on, MBS let women drive. So they must have experienced some sort of liberation. So perhaps you could answer the question in terms of the Gulf. Yeah,
we're talking today about they went from driving to now the international space, there's a Saudi woman in space now.
Right, exactly.
Which is great. So this goes back to, I think there's more overlap between ideologies in the States when it comes to some of these issues. They're more alike than different, although I also see what Dalius was saying, that there's also a shift so when states kind of apply Sharia, or when it comes to kind of, on a local level, when it comes to fighting vice or fighting alcohol, going after gay activists and, all that. I think that's something that we usually overlook, that how these regimes often are more similar to radical religious activists than they're different. So if you go to like Sisi's Egypt or Bashar Assad's Syria and so on and so forth, there is actually even there's a genuine attitude towards, for example, things like gay activism, just one example, because they see it as a Western import, kind of an imperial way of trying to infiltrate the culture and therefore the politics and kind of really, it's kind of the same thing that you see with Putin's Russia, where there's that macho manosphere activism against, feminism, against gay rights, against all those things. And I think that, I mean, it can kind of generalize that a little bit and say, when it comes to other than political activism, I think there's a lot of space there for states to say we are the custodians of religion and Sharia and so on and so forth, and that's what they try to assert. This secularization, I think Peter addressed that before. What it looks like mutually exclusive between kind of secularization and Sharia, and a lot of it's actually compatible. They think they're secularized in the sense that there's a space for religion and then a space for activism and engagement, political participation, but both are the domains of the state somehow in the region, rather than this is separate from this, as in different actors play that differently. So, and also remember that much of the past century, the activism of religion by religious groups has been at a neighborhood level, like the Salafism in Egypt, for example, in the center, Alexandria, for example. They have always been active, even during Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mubarak, Sadat Mubarak. And today, but they're active in agitating against certain practices in their religion, from alcohol to feminism to all the different things. And states sort of tolerate that because they think that that's a way to vent about certain things. What it becomes a red line is when these forces appropriate in the state's mind, in the regime's mind, that appropriate these to reach power. So it's really that leap from practicing Sharia to reaching power somehow, to implement these Sharia laws through power. That makes sense.
Thank you. So there's one question that asks, is peace part of the religious message? So I guess we could sort of apply this to, the state tactics. And so I guess it's a general question, but perhaps we could sort of look at it in terms of, is peace with neighbors in the region, or peace in general, peace within society, is this part of the religious message that states are advancing? And I guess, again, one thing that we haven't really touched upon, maybe you could do this briefly, we only have 3 minutes, all of you, but how certainly this kind of, all the strategies that we've talked about has had to create some instability within Arab societies. And despite the changing of demographics, despite all the factors that you have explained, which have contributed to the state's success in dominating religious practice and messaging. But are states concerned that these strategies, the domination of the religious sphere, is creating instability or is not creating a peaceful environment for their citizens? Peter, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so I think that in the vision of the kind of statist, officially approved Islam, some concept of peace is central, but it's peace understood as stability, as the absence of threat to what the state views as the necessity of its own reproduction and power in order to ensure that stability. So, this is why I think we find countries in the GCC region sponsoring this endless parade of summits and conferences focused on coexistence and tolerance and peace and forums for peace. And there's a strategic logic to that. On the one hand, it sort of helps to distract from the various ways that the same governments that sponsor these conferences are also engaged in settings like Yemen, Libya, and Syria in ways that produce outcomes that are very different from peace. But it's also part of this kind of broader value offering to their effort to position themselves as global players that are seeking to kind of build out a new portfolio of economically driven global engagements that require, the presence of an openness to engaging with people of other backgrounds. So peace is quite central to it, but it's, in my view, a very kind of pragmatic and instrumentalized conception of peace.
Thank you. Dalia, briefly, and then we'll get to Hassan quickly. We only have a few minutes left.
I wholeheartedly agree with Peter. I just want you to think about these countries that, for example, a country like Egypt has between 60 and 80,000 political prisoners, where 100% of the media is controlled by the state security apparatus, 100%, where anything anyone says or does outside of the state narrative can lead you not just to be disappeared, but members of your family disappeared. There's a report called Cycles of Hell, where is talking about what happens to women in women's prisons, women who are arrested because of the activities of their brothers or fathers, and how they are gang raped in prison. And so we talk about peace, the symbolic conversation of political peace amongst allies at the expense of your population is not a narrative that's going to go so far when so much of it lies in repression. And so I think when we talk about religion, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, religion, religious doctrine, religion and faith and practice and scripture is very different and separate from the politicization of religion by the state as a mode of social control.
Thank you. Hassan, for the...
I think in short, the saying, they make a desolation and call it peace. In that sense, I mean, it is peace in the sense that there's an absence of anything else.
Thank you. So thank you very much to all three of you for an excellent discussion that was very complicated and nuanced. And thanks very much to Marissa for hosting this event, and to all of you who have joined us. Thank you, and stay safe.